A good Erev Shabbos, everyone. Erev Shabbos, Parshas Bhaaloscha, Parshas Shlach, Bhaaloscha in America, Shlach in Eretz Yisrael. And again, I encourage you to look at last year's recording. You can see it on the YouTube channel. Just go down to the Parsha, and we had the same problem, Shlach Bhaaloscha, and spoke a beautiful idea there. Same problem, but different, somewhat different solution. The problem is that the two Parshas are linked together in a very, very strong way. The end of Bhaaloscha and the beginning of Shlach, the end of Bhaaloscha is the story of the Lashon Hara of Miriam on Moshe Rabbeinu, and the beginning of this week's Parsha is the Parsha of the Lashon Hara that was spoken by the Meraglim, by the spies when they came to Eretz Yisrael. Rashi points out the connection between the two, and he says, Lama nismacha Parshas Meraglim, Parshas Miriam. Why are these two Parshas connected to each other? Lefi shelaksa aliske diba shedibra be'achia. That because she was she suffered because of the Lashon Hara that she spoke about her brother, and these wicked guys, the 12 spies, saw it, and the 10 of the 12 spies, they saw it, and they didn't take Musa, they didn't take a lesson from it, because they went ahead and they spoke the Lashon Hara. They didn't learn the terrible lesson of it. It's a tremendous problem, this Chazal, because what exactly was expected of these Meraglim? To look at Miriam speaking about her brother, and then they were supposed to extrapolate from there and say, oh, I guess we shouldn't speak about the land of Israel. And why would they even think that this is called Lashon Hara? The Miriam gossiped maybe about her brother, but they weren't gossiping about anything. They were told to give a report, and they were giving a report. They were doing exactly what they were mandated to do. So why would they even have connected the two things to each other? There's no reason to have believed that this was on any way connected to Miriam. That's problem number one. Problem number two is the antidote to the story of the spies is actually in the end of the Parsha. At the end of the Parsha, we have the story of the mitzvah of Tzitzis. And we're commanded to fix Tzitzis to the corners of our garments so that we see them and we remember all the commandments of the Torah. And in a way, that's supposed to be a redemption. It's supposed to be a fixing of the sin of the spies. What's the shaychus? What's the connection between the tzitzis and the sin of the spies? Plus, within the tzitzis, the whole concept of uriyisimo, so you will see them when you remember all of my commandments. And then you have the Techeles, you have the blue. The rabbis tell us that what's the reason that we have the blue? We have the blue strings because it reminds us of the sea, which reminds us of the sky, which reminds us of God's throne. That's a little subtle. It's a little much to be able to make that. You look at the blue, and all of a sudden you remember, you remember the Kisei HaKavod, you remember God's throne. It's a little difficult. Plus to say that you see tzitzis and you remember all the mitzvahs of the Torah. My sons and I were once standing in a bank when they were little boys, and Yaakov and Yonah, myself, and the lady comes over and says to one of my boys, she says to me, she says, your son has some strings hanging out of his pants. Oh, and your other son does. Oh, and so do you. I just, with strings, it's a bunch of strings hanging out of the garments. What's the significance of the strings? It reminds you of all the commandments of the Torah. It reminds you you're sloppy. Was it remind you of the commandments of the Torah? Oh, you know why? Because tzitzis, the gematria of tzitzis, is 600, and then you have the 8 knots and the 8 strings and the 5 knots, so that equals 13. So it comes out to be 613. That'll remember you all the mitzvahs. Oh, do me a favor. We have to sit there with a little cheat sheet, reminding you. Oh yeah, tzitzis reminds me of this. Oh, that's how. Like who's going to remember that? What does this mean? So I'll tell you an amazing thing. I think the secret lies in the word Techeles. In that blue that you have to tie onto the tzitzis, onto the garment. Because the word Techeles is also the word TACHLIS. TACHLIS, the purpose, the goal. Our job in life is to be able to see TACHLIS. Is to be able to look at the purpose and the goal of things, to be able to look beyond the surface and to be able to recognize what's really going on there. What does the Kadosh Baruch Hu really want from me? When he asks me to do these mitzvahs, when he expects of me certain things, when he gives me a gift called Shabbos, when he expects me to be involved in the study of Torah all day long, what is all this about? What's living beyond the surface? One of the greatest tragedies is that when we live life on the surface, when everything is all about the cover of the book and not what's inside, when everything is all about the kankan and not masha b'tocho, when everything is about the surface, the outside, and not about what's really going on inside, what's really behind the scenes, behind the surface, what's the reality. And it's such a tragic way to live superficially. And I think that was the sin of the spies. Miriam made a terrible blunder. And her blunder was that she lived superficially. She looked at this superficially. She looked at Moshe Rabbeinu. She looked at what Moshe Rabbeinu was doing vis-a-vis his wife, and she looked at it in a superficial kind of way. This was a terrible thing. But if she would have looked at it deeper and recognized who Moshe Rabbeinu was and be able to see the thing for the reality, that Moshe Rabbeinu was the leader of Klal Yisrael, was the speaker with God, that he had this relationship with God that was like nobody else's, then she would have been able to see things from a very different way. Of course, Moshe Rabbeinu doesn't come home. Of course, Moshe Rabbeinu has to be holy for every moment because God could come to him if she had only looked beyond the surface. What we expected of the Meraglim was not about Lashon Hara. What we expected of the Meraglim was to look beyond the surface, to learn the lesson of Miriam and to understand that life is taking place beyond the surface. And you have to be able to see that. When you go into the land, you see people dying. It's not about people dying. When you go into the land and you feel like grasshoppers, it's not because you're grasshoppers, it's because there's something very deep going on here. And you have to be able to recognize, you have to be able to look beyond the surface and to be able to see that. But they didn't have the ability. And you know what Rashi calls them? What Chazal call them in the Medrash Tanchuma? Urishoyim halalu rov v'lo musar. That's rishus. That's evil. Because that's living and seeing only the front and not seeing reality. That's divorcing God and meaning from everything we do. What's the remedy for that? The remedy for that is tzitzis. Is looking at strings that are hanging out of your garments and recognizing, don't just look at strings hanging out of your garment. Remember that there's something much deeper than this. Don't just look at a blue color and see, isn't that pretty? It's blue? Oh, it's so pretty. Look at it and recognize that the blue has a meaning. And we have to go back into our heads and find the meaning. I don't care if you get to the Kisei HaKavod. I don't care what that blue means to you. But what that blue means is think, observe, look beyond the surface. We spend so much of our life lost on the surface of life and the superficialities of life that we don't even recognize. Things are happening in front of our eyes and we don't understand the ramifications because we're not thinking and we're not paying attention. And that's the remedy for the Chet HaMeraglim, because the real Chet HaMeraglim, the real sin of the spies, was not paying attention, not looking beyond the surface. And that's the tzitzis. Wake up. Don't just see it for what it looks like. See life for what it really is. And everything about our existence changes. L'tov, when we're able to see and to live beyond the surface, beyond the front, beyond the veneer. Everybody should have an amazing, awesome, beautiful Shabbos. Shabbos.